Welcome back. Well, if you just joined us, you're watching KTN Prime, and right now we are shifting over to tonight's discussion. As Ugandans go to the poll today, they are faced with the choice of propelling a leader into his fifth decade in power or backing a candidate pushing for change. President Yoweri Museveni, the current president of Uganda, has been in office since 1986 and is seeking a seventh successive election victory. His main challenger, politician Bobi Wine, has promised a revolution in governance and reforms, and of course a touch on corruption, and votes are currently being counted in Uganda as opposition also alleges rigging. I have an interesting panel with me to discuss tonight's topic, Uganda deciding, will the will of the people prevail? We have Mwanase Ahmed, a Pan-African Solidarity Network coordinator, the lady right in the middle. Thank you for joining us. And we have also Dr. Edgar Gidua, who is a diplomatic and security analyst to my very right. And of course, we also have Dismas Mukua, a regional and governance expert to my far right. It's a pleasure to have you all.
Thank you.
I know you've seen the developments today, and it's been very interesting to see what's happening, technical challenges, accusations of rigging, issues at the polling stations, and the voting begins a bit later for some of them. But before we go into the discussion further, I just want us to take a look at some of the fact sheets regarding Uganda's election. Of course, we know that President Yoweri Museveni is running as well for this particular election. President Yoweri Museveni is 81 years, and he has been in office since 1986, and he's seeking his seventh term, and he's also the third longest serving African leader. He took power in 1986, by the way, and he pledged during that time to restore democracy to Uganda. And his main challenger, Bobi Wine, is 43 years. Real name is Robert Chagulanyi. He is the strongest opposition candidate, and his NUP party is the largest opposition in parliament. Of course, Bobi Wine's party there promises governance, a revolution, sweeping reforms, and strong support. And he's, of course, having a very strong support there among the youth, urban, and working class. Bobi Wine has tried to go against Museveni a couple of times before, and of course this time round just hoping that he will be able to clinch the seat, the coveted seat of Uganda's presidency. And of course, just to understand, what are Ugandans voting for in today's election? Here we're looking at the presidential run that has 8 candidates running for this particular seat of the presidency. Of course, we also know that there are there's a parliamentary election there that constitutes of 353 constituency seats, and also another parliamentary election that constitutes positions of 146 women representative positions, that is. Of course, just a look at Uganda's election fact sheet, and this being the last thing we'll look at as we go into the discussion. We are looking at today's election consisting of 8 presidential candidates, and of course 10.3 million male voters, 11.3 million female voters, and this according to the Uganda Electoral Commission. It's an interesting look at what is happening in Uganda. Yoweri Museveni has been in presidency for such a long time, and this is something we witness across Africa, leaders holding on to power for so long, perhaps some of their citizens feeling, they want change, but getting that change is almost impossible, or it's very difficult. But I just want to begin with you, Dismas, just to hear, what do you make about today's events as far as the Uganda election?
First of all, you've raised very critical issues around term limits and tenure for presidencies. And it's the case that the majority of African leaders have got a phobia for the 2-term limit. And I think it's important for all of us to accept that you may be the sharpest tool in the shade, but you have to respect the constitution of your country. And also you shouldn't change the constitution to suit your interests. Because you recall the Ugandan constitution had an upper age limit and a 2-term limit. But for some reason, President Museveni and his cartel decided to review it. So I think it's important for Africans to respect the 2-term limit. And even for the Kenyan situation, maybe we need to suggest that, especially from the civil society, that even members of the National Assembly, Senate, and MCAs don't do more than 2 terms. Because there's evidence to suggest that when you're in a particular position and you do more than 2 terms, then you start developing the fear of the unknown. That what happens if you leave office? You remember it was the case for Robert Mugabe. There was a general phobia that what is going to happen with my family, with my estate when I leave office. And I suspect that is the fear with President Museveni. If you're talking about the elections for today, you don't need to take a bet on who is going to be declared the winner after 48 hours. And I think the biggest challenge for President Museveni is how to manage Uganda after the results have been pronounced by the Electoral Commission.
Let's hear from Manasseh. Manasseh, what do you make about today's events? We've heard of, seen reports of technical glitches. We've seen accusations coming from the opposition of rigging. I mean, there's a lot that's happened today. And unfortunately, there's been an internet shutdown in Uganda. What do you think about what is happening right now, considering this is a very critical election?
Thank you. I think first to take a step back, everything that's even led up to today on any and every international standard does not meet the qualities of what would be called a free and fair and democratic election. So prior to even getting to voting day, there's been abduction of opposition. There's been the Electoral Commission disqualifying, denominating people after they've been nominated and campaigning for several months. So the Electoral Commission is now also acting as a voter and deciding who should be denominated, leaving NRM unopposed in many positions. So 20 MPs were denominated from the opposition party, leaving 20 unopposed going into this election. Beyond that, there's been a lot of violence, enforced disappearances, arbitrary arrests, and from when the campaign began until now, over 750 people from NUP, as well as their supporters, have either been disappeared or detained, arbitrarily detained. So there's been a huge amount of sabotage in the electoral climate, even leading up to what took place today. The voter registrar was not released in advance, so people couldn't thoroughly audit it. And there was voters who appeared multiple times. So there are voter cards where you had 3 different voter registration numbers. There were deceased people on the voter registrar. There were babies on the voter registrar. So, and then the amount of money that was spent to procure this system that was actually manufactured to fail. Because ultimately, if it worked well, it would have been a lot harder to steal an election. So there's been so many elements that have curated what we would actually call a non-election. Right. Because an election is based on democratic, fair, lawful processes. So that's the context. And then today, what we saw was, a big amount of force that's been deployed into the rural areas, into the CBD over the past few days. So when you're having that significant amount of military presence and you're actually hearing directly that if you stay near the polling station, as per your right, as per the law, you're allowed to stay 20 meters away. But basically they were told by many different spokespeople from within the military and security forces that you will be shot and there will be violence. So it created a very uneasy climate for people to go out and express their civic right. And then we get into the stuffed ballots and the non-functional machines and, delayed opening for polling stations. And
accusations of rigging.
Yes.
Well, Dr. Kithua, when you look at what happened in Tanzania the other day, and this is really a concern for the region. We had an election in Tanzania, witnessed some of the things we're seeing in Uganda, where the citizenry felt they needed change, but you see the government is building its power on, so to speak, controlling how the voting takes place. And of course, at the end of the day, the results were said not to be free and fair. The election was termed not to be free and fair. And the question was the result even legitimate? And we are seeing, so to speak, similar occurrences in Uganda. We know that the media has been locked out of covering this election. as well as KTN, the Standard Group has been locked out, amongst other media houses. That's speaking of the fact that, there's no accountability that can be held from the international or regional community. Dr. Githua, when you look at what's happening in Uganda, comparing it to Tanzania, and the need for change in most of these African countries, what do you make of it?
Yeah. For me, I think the biggest worry for Africa and for Africans is the shrinking democratic space that is slowly creeping back into African, political circles, where we have leaders who are now stretching their constitutions, violating human rights, and an increase in impunity, an upsurge in impunity. Because now, like what happened in Tanzania, I wouldn't even call that an election. That was a shambolic facade of some sort. I mean, who gets elected with 31 million people vote and then you get a 97% vote when you're running against yourself, so to speak. So that was not an election, honestly, in Tanzania. The playbook and Uganda are the ones actually who taught Tanzania what I would call these bad manners, because Uganda shut down the internet. They've done this in the past. So, Tanzania borrowed from them. My worry is the increased impunity that is creeping back into African political circles, where voter suppression and the human rights and people's freedoms to choose their elected leaders are increasingly, people are not being given the space to do it. Unfortunately, this will push people to a point whereby, and I believe one of these fine days in one of these countries, voters are going to say no, and there'll be a protest that will probably lead to bloodshed and a revolution of some sort. That is where we are headed, because you'll only disenfranchise voters up to a certain level. With the young people and young population and this need for change, like you've rightly said, sooner or later, the straw will break the camel's back and we will have a revolution or a pushback that will pretty much almost disintegrate that social, the country, the social fabric of a country. So what's happening in Uganda is, it's unfortunate. Like what my colleagues have said, we can always bet and tell who is going to win the election. To Uganda's, at least to Uganda's credit, it will be in the 50-something% margin, all right? With all this, you'll hear probably the incumbent has come back with maybe a 56, 57%. And of course, one or two serious challengers ran against him. Tanzania was a sham. There was no election in Tanzania. Yeah.
Dismas, when you look at Museveni's tenure, it's been, he took power by force 40 years ago, and he has been in the presidency for such a long time. I tend to question, what impact has this had on the country, the development, human rights violations that have been reported? What does Yoweri Museveni's presidency mean for Uganda? What's the impact as it is right now?
As it's been campaigning, his slogan has been stability and progress. And he says that among all the presidential candidates, he's the only one who can make the nation stable. The rest are going to create instability. And he's done probably the highest number of rallies for a president in the East African region, reminding people of where they've come from. And when you speak to Ugandans, they tell you that the way he paints the picture, it makes everybody nervous. And he has said that for him, it's going to be stability and progress. But now the challenge of being a president, like for instance, the person who is running against him, against President Museveni, was maybe 3 or 4 years old when President Museveni took office. So President Museveni, one would easily say that he is stronger than all systems and institutions within Uganda. You can even venture and say that he's actually a one-man system. That if you're not dancing to his drum beats, then you're going to be in trouble. Now, what we need, and speaking as a member of the East African community, is to ensure that every member state has got very strong institutions, very strong systems, so that you don't have political personalities who are more powerful than systems. But again, to the credit of Uganda, unlike other countries, they've allowed in observers. The observers who are observing the election. The question would be whether or not they've got unlimited access to all these facilities. And we should also encourage a country like South Sudan also to venture into doing an election, whether or not it's going to be free, fair, and credible. People in South Sudan, do not know the meaning of an election because they don't know how they're going to participate in that. Now, talking about strong institutions, I saw the Electoral Commission in Uganda today. Their chairman, Justice Mugenyi, has been giving updates on what is happening. So wherever civil society or even other candidates raise issues, the chairman has been coming up giving those issues. Now, that one doesn't apply in Kenya today. For instance, you've got the new chairman of IBC. For the last couple of days, he's been very quiet. You remember the Honorable Musalia Mudavadi said, maybe there is an opportunity to have a referendum moment. And one we expected that Mr. Ethekon would actually come out and give his position. Now, every Kenyan should have an interest in what is happening within East Africa. Like, for instance, with the internet blackout in Uganda, I understand there's a lot of business which has suffered in Mombasa. Goods and services that are supposed to go to Uganda, the goods are not being cleared. And you know, from Uganda, then you go to Rwanda, you go to the eastern part of DRC. So there's a lot of business opportunities lost as a result of what has happened in Uganda. Because I understand if you want to clear anything at the port of Mombasa, everything now is electronic. So when there's that blackout, nothing is taking place. And I'm sure everybody would agree that you cannot have a strong democracy, number one, if you don't have a strong media. I mean, like, for instance, in the US today, what is keeping Trump in check is the media, because the Republicans, they've been beaten into a pulp. They're not saying anything. So you need to have a very strong media. And also you need to have a very strong civil society. But you know, in most countries within East Africa, there's no strong civil society to write home. There is no strong media. Before coming to this show, I watched a bit of conversations within the Uganda media. And they were saying that they have not seen so many military men in the streets like in the last election. Now, when they say that, you begin to ask yourself, are they actually calling a spade, or maybe they're giving a government narrative? And
you know, Mwanase, I want to just throw this to you as well, Dismas. The argument from the Ugandan government of shutting down internet was to curb misinformation, you know, and to possibly just avoid having any kind of unrest sparked by reports, you know, going around on social media. But is this really the case? Because one, there are businesses that have been affected. Many Ugandans are not able to carry on with business. Some of them do business online. So the last couple of days, it's been a bit difficult. But more than this is just having the accountability of information being able to be disseminated to other African countries and just across Uganda to know exactly what's happening. What do you make of this, Wanase? Shutting down the internet, hindering media houses from covering the election. What does this spell for Uganda and for the East African community that's watching?
Thank you. If it's okay, I'd also like to just comment on the observers in civil society, and then I can transition to that.
Go ahead.
When we talk about, I think, any credit being given to Uganda, and I'd like to approach it factually. When you look at observation, right now we have the AU who have gone in to observe, but where the EU and other bodies actually are just, they're refusing to send any observers because they've done it in the past. There's so many irregularities, and there's no goodwill to implement any of the recommendations that have been made. So a lot of other international bodies have refused to even send observers. Last election in Uganda, Museveni, they banned joint observation between civil society. So civil society also are completely unable to work together to observe the elections. There were members of civil society and organizations that in 2021, for doing civic work, were banned and were deregistered and were shut down. So some of them were able to start operating again 2 years later. Some still have not been allowed to date. So the civil society is also collapsed. It's been squeezed, you know, it's been shut down and disenfranchised and unable to actually operate in any meaningful way. And we've seen that again now, 4 days before the election. The Chapter 4, which is the network of lawyers who provides and dispatches lawyers throughout the whole country, the National Coalition of Defenders, Human Rights Defenders, I think at least 6 very significant civil society organizations, with more to come, were shut down. We're told they can no longer operate, bank accounts frozen. So they have compromised the ability to respond to any human rights crisis, any human rights violations, detentions. Beyond that, then, shutting down the internet. It's similar to Samia saying that X was being used for circulating pornographic material and therefore had to be shut down. Now, it's a complete lie to try to cover up the fact that they would like to have pre-rigged elections, have rigged elections, have ballot boxes being transferred around that haven't been sealed, oppression of, potential for human rights abuses, having threatened violence. There's been a big challenge with NRM Ghetto Brigade, which is a state-sponsored militia, which has been causing havoc in Uganda today. So the internet shutdown is very intentional, and it's certainly not to spread misinformation. It's so that the world cannot see what's happening behind those closed doors.
Dr. Kithua, looking at the young people of Uganda, they are the dominant among the foot soldiers of Uganda's election campaign. And you tend to ask, do you think these voters who are located in one of the world's youngest countries can give an 81-year-old another term in this election?
Yeah, thanks for your question. I remember President Museveni, I had him, when he gave his acceptance speech, accepting the nomination to be the candidate for his party, he told people, vote for me this one more time. This is the last time I'm standing. So it was like, it's like he felt and he knew that the winds of change are blowing, and he was just trying to tell people, just give me one more term. He's 81. God granting him health, that will be 86. I don't know whether he'll feel like running once again. But the young people in Uganda definitely want change. They see in Bobi Wine someone who represents their aspirations. And like you rightly said, from 1986 till now, Museveni, yes, played his role, liberated the country, puts its systems in place. But if you ask me, probably by 2010, he should have probably thought of grooming a successor. So the young people in Uganda want change. All they've known, all their lives is one president. And yes, granted, he has brought prosperity to Uganda up to a certain extent. And they are probably thinking, let's get a fresh set of ideas. But then, of course, Museveni still feels, I have something in my bag to give. So the young people in Uganda definitely, some will be, I like what my colleague said, some will still vote for Museveni because of the fear-mongering that has been around the campaign, that I represent stability, the fear of the unknown. If you vote for somebody else, the country could descend into chaos and all that. That card has been played a lot of times in Uganda. But I know the young people in Uganda want change. And that is evident if you look at Bobi Wine's rallies. Some of them were interfered with, but the few that he was able to hold successfully, there's a huge population of young people. In him, they see the aspiration. They see hope. They see he probably has new ideas. So to Bobi Wine, time is on his side. He's young. He could run again and again and again, like 3-4 more times. So eventually one day, hopefully he will get it. And he'll probably carry the aspirations of the young people. But currently, as things stand, and from what my colleagues have analyzed, there's only one prediction coming out of this election. And I know for some young people in Uganda, they will definitely have to, their hopes will be dashed. Of course, they will feel like, we've been disenfranchised, and they can't fight against the state. The state is very powerful. But one day, they will have their say at the ballot.
Dr. Kithua, when you look at what you're mentioning, there is a crop of young people who believe we need change. Yeah. We need to get someone who can bring in new ideas and provide some new leadership. Yeah. But the question also that begs at this moment is Bobi Wine really ready for the presidential seat at this time?
So let's put it this way. It's a good question you've asked. And I could counter it with a question. When is the right time? All right? The older generation keep on calling the young people future leaders. When will that future come? So you'll be the future leader till you're 50, till you're 60. Someone still looks at you like you're a child. Give Bobi Wine that chance. My view is let's just digress a little bit. Look at Traore. Granted, he came into power through a coup. He's 35, he's 37, 38 years old. If what we've been seeing in the media is right about what he's doing in Burkina Faso, look at what a 38-year-old, a 40-year-old, give or take, can do. Those young, fresh, revolutionary kind of ideas. So Bobi Wine may not be ready in the sense that he has not been in leadership before, but he's been a member of parliament. That in itself means that some people trusted him. His constituency trusted him to give him that leadership. Now he aspires to do something greater for Uganda. Until you give him the chance, you'll really never know whether he's right or not. So leadership, leaders are made. That's what I believe in. People say leaders are born. I believe leaders are made. So he's been exposed to enough stimuli, and he understands the issues Ugandans and the young people are facing in Uganda. So is he ready? I would say give him the chance and let him prove himself. Let him mess up and then don't elect him again. Yeah, but when will you ever know he's a failure if he's not given the chance? That's what I would say. When is the right time? That's what I'm asking.
And it's for that reason that every country needs strong institutions and strong systems. So in the event that you elect somebody who doesn't have capacity or competence, it could easily be checked. Yeah. But again, my comments are contraindicated by what has happened in the US. For the longest time, we believed that the US has got the most powerful systems. But Mr. Donald Trump has come in and he has shaken the Supreme Court, he has shaken the Congress, he has shaken everything, even the media. I mean, you look at some of those White House news conferences, the way he's scolding journalists, you really begin to wonder whether everything is okay. However, you did ask a very important question about misinformation and disinformation. Now, if you fear misinformation and disinformation, then you cause a blackout. One may easily say that because you fear road accidents, you're not going to put up roads. Yeah, so that let's not put up roads so that we don't have road accidents. Governments must be very proactive and come up with the infrastructure to manage misinformation and disinformation. In every community, there are going to be people who are going to abuse the system. And one would even say that maybe out of 1,000 people, it's maybe 1 or 2 who are going to engage in misinformation and disinformation. So you cannot afford to disenfranchise the entire country on account of a few guys who are going to engage in misinformation and disinformation. One would expect the security agencies to work with scholars and practitioners to come up with infrastructure to manage misinformation and disinformation. And one would even venture to say that even for the Kenyan situation, if we don't get that facility to manage misinformation and disinformation, we are going to be in trouble during next year's election. Because everybody with a smartphone in Kenya today essentially has got a media house. So somebody can get a clip, somebody can send a comment, and then in a very short space of time, it's shared all over. So even as a nation, we need to manage that. But going to another critical point about these elections. It's important for leaders, when you assume office, to know that this is not your piece of land. This is not a title deed. That you could be the best, but please come and do your 2 terms and take a walk. I mean, from the time Museveni became president, we've had in Kenya, we've had President Moi, we've had President Kibaki, we've had President Kenyatta, and now we've had President Ruto. So at least we've had 4. And I think a similar number in Tanzania. And when President Museveni was taking office at the very first time, he actually indicated he doesn't understand why people do more than 2 terms. But now that he's going to do his 9th term, what are Kenyans supposed to do? We must encourage all our neighbors. And maybe the media comes in, civil society comes in, and the East African community comes in, that we strive to ensure that the elections, the outcome of the elections, in fact, represents the interests and aspirations of the community. Because, like for instance, if you're talking about South Sudan, part of the reason why you've got a very high concentration of generals and people don't want to leave office is the fear of the unknown. And the fear of the unknown grows in leaps and bounds the longer you stay in office. And you know, Kenya has set a very good example. No,
Dismas, there's a question here. As I listen to you, I have this one question. You see, Museveni is widely believed to favor his son. Yeah, that's military chief Muhoozi Kainerugaba, who is supposed to be supposedly his successor. And that has been the conversation across the region. And do you think perhaps, Kainerugaba has not come to maturity? And maybe that's why the president decides, hey, I'm going to run another term, because perhaps his son is not really at par with what is expected of him, perhaps to take over the presidency. What do you think about that, Dismas?
Dr. spoke something about age and leadership. There's no evidence to say that if you are young or you are old, then leadership outcomes are different. If you look at Kenya, Like, for instance, how old was Tom Mboya when he came up with Session of Paper 10? How old was Ken Matiba when he took office? How old was Dr. Z.T. Onyonka when he became an MP? How old was Obama when he became a president? How old was Tony Blair? How old was Mele Zenawi? How old is Trump? In my view, for you to become a leader, the only thing you need to demonstrate is character, capacity, and competence. Well, given most elected leaders have got no character, but you demonstrate capacity and competence.
The three: character, competence.
I mean, if you look at
he's been able to build his country, and that's what some of them say, you know, the citizens and just across the region. I think one of you mentioned that the economy has been doing okay. Character-wise, perhaps it's just the issue of holding on to power. What do you think? Does he possess character that is sufficient to be, you know, for him to be deemed a good president?
I will not discuss about character, but capacity and competence, that one he has demonstrated, that he's got capacity and competence. Do you know that most of food products are cheaper in Uganda compared to Kenya? If you're even looking at eggs,
torturing people in your basement,
he's been harnessing those factors. But the critical issue is, I wouldn't even have a challenge if Museveni's sons want to run for president, provided the election is free, fair, and credible. That he presents himself amongst other candidates, and he campaigns and he wins. That there is no voter suppression, there is no voter stuffing, there is no voter rigging, because the fact that you are Museveni's son does not disqualify you.
Let's hear from you, Mwana.
Go to the pitch and present yourself.
How we are even discussing somebody who's a renowned torturer who openly, completely has complete neglect, suspended rule of law, who can openly say that he's going to cut Bobi Wine's head off and that he's torturing someone in his basement, while he actively is torturing people in his basement, holding people in the fridge in unknown military barracks for years and years and years, taking people away from their families. He is a gangster. He's a thug, he's a criminal, and he should have no position in any government. He should be in prison himself. So if that's the type of analysis that we're using to gauge capacity and competence, it's very concerning. I don't think someone like that should have any place outside of prison. That's what prisons are built for, criminals such as him. That's my first comment. I think also on disinformation, I think we should really acknowledge that the government are the leaders of disinformation. The amount of money that's spent on propagandists is part of the thing that's keeping our economy afloat here in Kenya, and that's government, state-sponsored propagandists. The character assassination, the AI videos, the disinformation that the regimes use. Tanzania, Kenya, even I'm sure Uganda, hire many PR firms in Kenya to spread disinformation. So if we need to regulate disinformation, actually the leaders of disinformation, we can't even refer to them as leaders. So I think we have, first we have to look at what is our standard, what is our benchmark when it comes to capacity, when it comes to competence, when it comes to leadership, when it comes to respect to rule of law, when it comes to impact that is actually beneficial for the majority. When you look at Uganda, when you look at the discrepancy and inequality, when you look at the infrastructure, when you look at the challenges that are affecting the majority of people, we can't just gauge progress based on, you know, a country's overall outputs, especially when the majority of that wealth is in the hands of the few. All right. I know that you mentioned earlier he might have something still in the bag to give. I think it's more how much can he continue to take in the bag.
Dr. Githua, if you look at the Ugandan economy, with the high rates of youth unemployment in a country where the majority of the population is under 30 years, the economy has become a key concern in the campaign period. Yeah. And if we just try to understand, you know, I'm listening to Mwanase. Of course, she's not really a supporter of what is happening in Uganda. And of course, it's very understandable. Violations of human rights, gagging of media, internet shutdown. And as she mentioned rightfully earlier on, it spells of an election that is probably as she says, free and not fair. I mean, not a free and fair election, I mean. So when we look at the economy of Uganda, Dismas says that President Yoweri Museveni has made progress economy-wise. He can't speak about character, but in terms of development, in terms of agricultural production, there's been a lot of development. But let's just hear in depth from you, Dr. Githua. What do you make of Uganda's economy as it is right now?
All right, thanks for your question. That's a technical question. Uganda's economy, like many economies in East Africa and in Africa, have taken a hit, gone through hard times and recession. But especially for Uganda, what works for them and what has worked in their favor is that Uganda is a mini bread basket. It's a green country. I've gone to Uganda a number of times and it's ever green. Food is very cheap. In fact, if you go to Uganda and you want to buy chicken, chicken is cheaper than beef, you know. It's like a staple food for Ugandans. So food is in plenty in Uganda. And I think for any country to survive, what has probably helped President Museveni stay in power is that that environmental boon that they got from God, that Uganda is evergreen. If Uganda faced climate issues like other African countries, and with how the economy has been run, they would have had many issues a long time ago. So the economy has taken a hit like all African economies and economies of the world. There is a high rate of youth unemployment, and that is why increasingly he's feeling the population turning hostile against him, because these are young people. Uganda is one of the few countries in East Africa that has very many universities and colleges. So they are a well-read population, but there are no jobs for them. And even if you say the digital space, in the gig economy, there's only so much people can do. So we have these youth who are feeling frustrated because they cannot get opportunities. The government is not doing enough, and largely the government can't produce the new jobs because the economy is not growing fast enough. The disparity between the rich and the poor, you know, that gap keeps on growing. Elite capture of state resources, because let's put it this way, let's have a frank discussion. President Museveni has been in power from 1986. It means the clique he has been ruling with, if they have not yet passed on, are still with him. A majority are in that age group of, you know, they are from 70 years and above. So the young people are seeing opportunities not opening up, they're not getting space to rise up to leadership, and their voice is not being heard. So there's a lot of frustration building within the social fabric of the Ugandan population. And that is why you find when a leader like Bobi Wine comes up, he generates and gathers a lot of interest. People feeling like you probably are the change we're looking for. So the Ugandan economy is just there. They are struggling like any other East African economy because of things outside beyond their control. Remember, during the Biden administration, the US-Ugandan relations tanked a little bit because of Uganda's stand on things like LGBTQ+. So they got some mini economic sanctions that really squeezed their economy. The AGOA thing, I'm not so sure that it went well for them. I think they were kicked out of AGOA. So the Ugandan economy has been suffering.
You know, I was coming there because when you look at, I think Wanase mentioned earlier on, the 2021 elections were termed a sham by the international community. Yeah. And again, she mentioned that international observers have been reluctant to take part in, you know, observing the affairs of the election from today. Yeah. And you mentioned also that, you know, the US and perhaps other international countries have had a hard time and not a very good relationship with Uganda. Yeah. How is the relationship right now between Uganda and the international community? It is not at its very best because, and granted, sometimes we probably need such people. President Museveni speaks his mind. He speaks his mind, and extracontinental forces do not like leaders who speak their mind. President Museveni is emancipated to the level where he speaks his mind and he does not care what anybody thinks about him. So Uganda is a sovereign country. He speaks his mind. He bashes Europe, bashes the West, and says whatever he wants. And such leaders are not very popular in the international system. What impact has this had on Uganda? It has definitely made Uganda, it has reduced, like what we're saying, them not being on AGOA, a lot of
because of the LGBTQ plus stand, when they said they were not going to pass those bills, Europe said you're violating human rights. So his relationship right now is not at the very best with Europe and with the US. And he appears to be okay with it. He's like, we don't need you to survive. And he's been preaching that gospel of Africa needs to do much for themselves, which is a much needed message, but at the expense of what is now happening to Uganda and the citizens of his country.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I wanted to just add two things. One that I had forgotten to mention on the accreditation. So in 2021, after the ban on joint election monitoring, they actually transferred observer accreditation to the military-led Crime Intelligence Department. So that is who accredits observers, which is actually in violating the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance as well. So it's people like the US and the EU who are just not even interested anymore. That was one. And just briefly there was some research that was recently done in November and December leading into the elections. And the majority, over 50% of, it was a sample taken of, I think, 3,500 people across 1,500 villages. And it was about what do they care about? What are the issues they care about? Are they ready? Are they ready to vote? Will they be participating? So from that, I think the largest issue, and the majority are youth, as mentioned, the majority of the voting population. So the biggest issue was the economy and was jobs. That came first and foremost. And only 19% of the people who participated in the citizens' poll said they wanted to maintain the status quo. So there's significant dissatisfaction. I just thought that would...
Great points there. And Monase, today we do know that the US President Donald Trump's administration has indefinitely suspended immigrant visa processing for nationals from 75 countries. Uganda is one of them, Dismas.
But
what does this mean for Uganda?
Trump is in check. That was the other question I had for you.
So some critical issues. Edgar's raised very important issues, especially around the economy. And it's a common thing that across Africa, the people with wealth, there is no evidence that they've harnessed the factors of production. That you've gone to the farm, you've grown your tea and coffee, eggs, or anything else. It's because of political proximity. And that is the obtaining situation in Uganda today. That if you're close to Museveni, probability of you being wealthy is extremely high. And then also number two, that he speaks his mind. Wherever he comes to Kenya or when he's attending these East African community meetings, he delivers very powerful speeches, especially when he's talking about markets. Probably from his Dar es Salaam University days. You remember after Trump visited Venezuela, he said, let them not try coming to Uganda. They can come by air or by water, but if they come by land, I'm going to catch them somewhere. He likes to speak his mind, and that is how he got into trouble with President Biden. But in my view, we can complain here till the cows come home, and then we don't make good progress. So we need to encourage that all presidents, especially within the East African framework, and we apply pressure from left, right, and center to have the key pillars of a strong democracy. Ensure that the media is very, very vibrant. Ensure that civil society is very, very vibrant. Let's come up with the two-term limit for every elective position. If a governor is going to do 2 terms, an MC should do 2 terms. Some people get into office, like especially in the US, those congressmen and senators, they've been around the block for a while. Some people get into office, and with CDF today, there are a number you cannot pull out of the National Assembly. Although fortunately for Kenya, the turnover is very high. And then, the typical voter should now start punishing leaders who do not deliver. Like for instance, a few days ago, there's been a debate about the usage of CDF in Kenya. The Rui is doing CDF very well. We need to get somebody outside the Auditor General or from these governance institutions to actually audit, come up with key performance indicators, and find out the members of the National Assembly who are using the CDF very well. But more important, and as we said, these times above number, and we're going to be talking about this for the next 1.5 years, we must place a huge premium on character, capacity, and competence.
And as we almost come to a close, Dismas, we see Uganda's political system, and I think Dr. Githo, you had mentioned, is dominated by leaders who came to power, decades ago and have never left. If we do see President Yoweri Museveni win for Uganda versus perhaps a loss for Bobi Wine, or whichever way, let me just hear from each of you, 30 seconds each. If we see a Yoweri Museveni win in Uganda's election today, what does that mean for the country, Dr. Githuwa?
Thanks. If Museveni wins, which is going to win with a 50-something% margin, definitely the aspirations of the youth get bashed for another 5 years. It is continuity of the same, the status quo remains the same. So nothing is going to change in Uganda in terms of outlook, because President Museveni is a one-man show. He's reached that level where he's an institution. Uganda is Museveni and Museveni is Uganda. So nothing is going to change for the foreseeable future. And unfortunately, that will mean that at 86, we don't have any guarantee that he'll be still willing to cede power to anybody else or to the younger generation.
Mwanase, let's hear from you.
I think you had mentioned earlier how there's a tipping point where people also don't accept this corruption, voter rigging, suppression. There's people who have been in jail since the last election, 2021, they've been in remand, still not been tried, still not been charged because they are part of the opposition. So now, once this election is rigged again, I think the people of Uganda also are not willing to just stand back and let that happen. And it's been a big part of NUP's slogan about protecting the vote, defending the vote, inaugurating. So we will leave it to the people of Uganda, because they are going to continue fighting for their country. We wish them courage, we wish them safety, and we must defend what is left, or what we must regain, of the democratic space in our countries.
Thank you.
If
final remarks.
If President Museveni retains his position, and probability is very high, I think everybody within the East African community, leaders and citizens, must encourage him to create very strong institutions which are going to outlive him. So that at least in the next general election, everybody can come to the table and present their credentials. And we must also set high standards, not only for Uganda, but all the neighboring countries that are going to have election. And then also not lose focus on Kenya as we go for 2027, and ensure that we elect people with that character, capacity, and competence. You remember, we've been warned times above number that some of the people present themselves for elections. They score an A in impunity, mediocrity, corruption. Others are kings of something called wash-wash. But we go ahead and elect them to the National Assembly, to the Senate. We make them governors and hope that the outcomes are going to shock anybody. So I think it's important for all citizens of the East African community to vote with their selfish interests in mind. If they don't do that, then you remember that senior sergeant in the military who some said, Sema Kimeumana. We'll keep on saying Kimeumana till the cows come home.
Thank you, Dismas. Well, that has been a very insightful discussion. Of course, we do hope that there will be developments in Uganda. Just to mention, of course, if everything goes to plan, by the way, as far as the counting is going on, the presidential vote should be known by 4 p.m. local time. That's 1 p.m. GMT on Saturday, 17th January. And we do hope that we will not have any kind of anarchy in the country. Thank you so much for making time. Mwanase Ahmed, Pan-African Solidarity Network Coordinator. Thank you so much for making time.
Thank you for
and of course, Dr. Githuwa, who is a diplomatic expert, and Dismas Mokua, as always. I mean, it's a pleasure to have you join us. I'm happy to have met Mwanase today, and Dr. Githuwa, it's my first time. But Dismas is also one of our people here. He always insightful. All of you have given very good remarks there. Dismas Mokua, a regional and governance expert. Thank you for making time. It's been a great discussion. Hearing the comments from Mwanase, very spirited, of course, touching on matters human rights, very big in the African region. If the citizens' voice is going to be heard, something needs to be done, especially on matters human rights. This has been a discussion on Uganda that went to the polls today, and the country is faced with the choice of propelling a leader into his 5th decade in power or backing a candidate pushing for change. That President Yoweri Museveni has been in office since 1986 and is seeking a 7th successive election victory, while his main challenger, politician Bobi Wine, has promised a revolution in governance. These are not the only candidates, by the way. There's also 6 other candidates who are hoping to clinch the position of president. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Leangari. Earlier on, my sign language interpreter was Philip Omundi. As always, it's a pleasure to have you join us. Have a good night and God bless you.